Lucia stepped onto the marble floors of the estate, her heels clicking softly but deliberately, each step echoing through the grand entrance hall. The chandeliers above cast a warm, golden glow, but it did little to soften the tension that had settled in the air. Guests, seated in small clusters, murmured quietly as their eyes discreetly followed her. She had not expected this reception to be friendly, yet the moment Alejandro spotted her, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Alejandro's face darkened, his jaw tightening as he took in her presence. "Get out now!" he bellowed, his voice cutting sharply across the room. Heads turned, conversations halted mid-sentence, and a hush fell over the gathering. "That child in your womb isn't mine." His words were harsh, accusatory, dripping with anger and disbelief. Every guest froze, unsure whether to intervene or retreat, as the tension between them became palpable. Lucia, however, did not flinch. Her back straightened, shoulders squared, and lips curved into a faint, confident smirk. She met his glare without a hint of fear. Inside, her heart raced, not from intimidation, but from the knowledge that she held the leverage he had completely overlooked. Alejandro's outburst, intended to humiliate her, had unwittingly set the stage for her moment of triumph. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Some guests exchanged incredulous glances, while others leaned forward, sensing the drama about to unfold. The air was thick with expectation, as though the estate itself had held its breath in anticipation. Alejandro stepped closer, his hand raised as if to emphasize his authority. Yet even in his aggression, he could not hide the subtle tremor of uncertainty creeping into his stance. Isabella, Alejandro's mistress, stood nearby, her pregnancy clearly visible beneath the tailored dress she had chosen for the evening. She clutched a delicate clutch in one hand, attempting to radiate confidence, but her eyes betrayed unease. She had come expecting to bask in Alejandro's approval, to assert her dominance over the ex-wife, yet the sharpness of his outburst and the calmness of Lucia unnerved her. Lucia's gaze swept the room subtly, taking in the reactions, noting the shifts in posture and attention. She recognized the power of silence in this moment. Words could inflame, but composure commanded respect. She allowed Alejandro's tirade to run its course, observing him closely. He spoke rapidly now, repeating accusations, gesturing wildly. But she remained unfazed. Each of his sentences, intended to dominate, only underscored his desperation. "You have no idea what you're claiming," he continued, voice tight, eyes flashing. "That child is proof of your betrayal." His face flushed with anger, yet his gestures grew uncoordinated, betraying the cracks in the authority he had assumed. Lucia shifted her weight slightly, letting her hand rest gently on her abdomen, not in fear, but as a subtle declaration of presence and control. "Alejandro," she said softly, her voice calm but carrying a weight that forced attention, "you seem certain of things you do not know. Perhaps you should listen before condemning." The room went quieter still, the contrast between her calm and his agitation stark and undeniable. Guests leaned forward slightly, curiosity growing. Some exchanged whispers. Who was right? Who had the truth? The tension was almost tangible, a living thing that twisted through the room. Alejandro's eyes flickered toward Isabella, seeking support, yet the mistress faltered, sensing the shift in dynamic that she had not anticipated. Lucia's smirk widened imperceptibly, a silent acknowledgement of the advantage she had seized. She did not raise her voice, she did not shout, she simply allowed her presence, her poise, to assert authority. Every guest could see it, the composure of the ex-wife versus the volatility of the man who had underestimated her. Alejandro's breathing grew more rapid, and he stepped forward, attempting to regain control through volume. "This is absurd, how dare you!" He stopped abruptly as he noticed the subtle expressions on the faces around him. Murmurs of agreement, nods of sympathy for Lucia, and small looks of disapproval towards him began to surface. The tide of perception was turning, and even he could feel it. Lucia took a measured step forward, closing the distance slightly, though still maintaining space between them. "Alejandro, you claim certainty.
Yet it is your assumptions that leave you exposed. Before you accuse, perhaps consider who is truly at fault. Her words were precise, deliberate, and they landed like a quiet, undeniable blow. The room seemed to exhale collectively, as if acknowledging the truth of her assertion without needing further explanation. Alejandro's eyes narrowed, the frustration in his expression now tinged with disbelief. He opened his mouth to retort, but the sound caught in his throat. Lucia's gaze held his, unflinching, confident, and entirely in control of the moment. Isabella's composure faltered further, and she took a small step back, realizing that her assumed dominance was crumbling before her eyes. The guests, sensing the turning point, shifted slightly, positioning themselves to witness what would happen next. The estate felt alive with anticipation. Every detail, the chandeliers, the polished floors, the subtle lighting, amplifying the drama in the center of the room. Alejandro's anger, once commanding, now appeared misguided and vulnerable. Lucia's smile remained calm, serene, yet charged with the promise of revelation. She had not needed to shout. She had not needed to confront aggressively. Her strength lay in presence, in timing, and in the subtle knowledge of the truth she carried.
Every glance from the guests reinforced the quiet authority she had claimed, a dominance achieved without force but through composure and intelligence. Alejandro's hand clenched slightly at his side, a small, involuntary gesture betraying the tension he could no longer mask. He attempted a final assertion of control, speaking quickly and sharply, but the room no longer followed his lead. The energy had shifted irrevocably, aligning with Lucia rather than him. Lucia allowed the moment to stretch, letting the weight of anticipation settle fully on Alejandro, on Isabella, and on every guest. Her smirk deepened slightly, imperceptible to anyone not paying close attention, signaling the next move she had prepared, an imminent revelation that would overturn all assumptions. The room's energy vibrated in expectation.
The climax of confrontation approaching with quiet inevitability. And as she stood there, calm, poised and unshakable, it became clear the night would not unfold according to Alejandro's arrogance or Isabella's assumptions. The balance of power had already shifted, and every guest present would soon witness the full measure of Lucia's intelligence, composure, and calculated patience. The first act of confrontation had begun, and the outcome would astonish them all. The tension in the room lingered like a heavy fog, thick and suffocating. Lucia remained calm, her gaze scanning Alejandro and Isabella with subtle precision. She had planted herself in the perfect position, not too close to provoke, not too distant to seem timid. Every small gesture, every inflection in her voice during her brief responses
Reinforced a quiet authority that Alejandro had never encountered before. He seethed, struggling to regain control, but the more he tried, the more unsteady he appeared. Isabella, sensing the shift, tried to assert herself. "Alejandro, perhaps we should leave her alone. This is ridiculous," she murmured, her hand lightly resting on her swelling belly, as if to remind everyone of her supposed legitimacy. Her voice, soft but deliberate, was meant to sway the crowd and remind them of the supposed truth she carried. Yet even as she spoke, her eyes flickered toward Lucia, betraying an underlying fear. The mistress had underestimated the calm power of the woman she sought to humiliate. Lucia, unaffected, allowed a small smile to touch her lips. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it carried the weight of anticipation. She had been preparing for this moment long before Alejandro's dramatic outburst. Every piece of evidence, every hint of truth she had collected was ready to be revealed. And she would do it with precision, allowing him to crumble without the need for aggression or spectacle. The guests had started to murmur again, their curiosity sharpening into intrigue. Some exchanged discreet glances, as if silently debating who was truly in control. Alejandro noticed the shift in attention, the way the room subtly turned toward Lucia rather than himself. His face flushed with anger, frustration, and the first flickers of fear. He had expected compliance, surprise, maybe even tears, but certainly not this unshakable composure. Lucia's eyes swept over the guests, noting their reactions without seeming to do so.
She recognized the power of perception in moments like this. Every slight nod, every quiet whisper reinforced her growing advantage. Alejandro's words had the weight of authority, but their impact was diminished because her presence challenged it. She allowed him to speak, to rage, and to assert, but she refused to yield. His own frustration began to betray him more than any words she could utter. "Do you hear yourself?" he barked, gesturing toward her sharply. "Do you expect anyone to believe this? After everything?" His tone wavered slightly, the cracks in his control becoming more pronounced. Isabella's attempt to support him now seemed fragile, almost desperate. She realized that the room was no longer merely observing, they were silently rooting for the underdog, captivated by Lucia's calm defiance. Lucia took a deliberate,
slow step closer, her posture perfectly measured, her expression serene. "Alejandro, you claim certainty, yet you speak from ignorance," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough for the nearest guests to hear clearly. "You have assumed what you do not know, and in doing so you have revealed your own arrogance." Her words were precise, deliberate, and they struck deeper than any shout or argument could have. The room seemed to hold its collective breath. Alejandro's face twisted with a mixture of rage and disbelief. He attempted another retort, raising his voice in desperation, but the force behind it was diminished. His audience, the very guests who had once hung on his charm and charisma, now observed him as a man losing control, undone by his own assumptions. The reversal of perception was subtle yet unmistakable, or Isabella's composure faltered further. Her attempts to interject now sounded hollow, weak, and ineffective. She glanced toward the guests nervously, realizing that her position as the supposed center of attention had already begun to slip. Her pregnancy, once a shield and source of social leverage, now seemed to accentuate her vulnerability. The room had begun to align itself unconsciously with Lucia. Lucia allowed herself a slight deliberate pause, letting the silence linger. Every second of quiet increased the anticipation. She knew that the revelation she carried would have maximum impact when timed perfectly. Alejandro's agitation had peaked, Isabella's confidence had waned, the guests were ready, fully alert, and waiting for the next move. She spoke again softly, almost as a whisper meant for Alejandro alone, yet audible to all. "You have accused me without proof, you have humiliated me without cause, and yet the truth has been right in front of you all along." Her eyes locked on his, unwavering, and for the first time the arrogance in his posture faltered entirely. The guests leaned in subtly, sensing the tension, the unspoken promise of revelation. Alejandro's hands clenched at his sides, his face tight, his jaw working as he struggled to maintain control. Isabella's breaths were shallow, her earlier bravado gone, replaced with uncertainty. She realized, perhaps too late, that her carefully constructed narrative was unraveling. Lucia allowed herself another small step forward, her presence commanding without seeming aggressive. "Alejandro," she said again, her tone calm, patient, but edged with undeniable authority. The story you have told everyone is incomplete. You have accused the wrong person, assumed the wrong truth, and humiliated the wrong woman." The pause that followed was electric. Every guest sensed the power of the words, the weight of the unspoken knowledge that something monumental was about to be revealed. Alejandro's anger shifted subtly into panic. His face paled slightly, his gestures became more erratic, and he realized finally that his attempt at public control had completely failed. He had underestimated Lucia, and now the audience, his family, friends, and social peers, were witnesses to his misjudgment. Lucia let the moment linger, letting Alejandro and Isabella feel the full impact of the shift. Her calm defiance contrasted sharply with his flailing confidence. The audience's attention now firmly rested on her, and drawn to her composure, her intelligence, and the quiet power she radiated. Alejandro's authority was crumbling, and the stage was perfectly set for the revelation that would follow. the exposure of the mistress carrying his real child, a truth he could no longer deny or control. Every eye in the room followed her subtle movements, every breath measured, every glance calculated. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. She was no longer the woman accused, no longer the target of humiliation. She was the orchestrator, the holder of truth, the calm in the storm, preparing to unveil the secret that would leave Alejandro stunned, Isabella speechless, and the entire room in shocked awe. The room was electric with anticipation, every guest silently holding their breath. Alejandro's face had gone pale, his arrogance dissolving into panic, while Isabella's confident facade had completely cracked. Lucia stood poised, her calm smirk perfectly timed, knowing that the moment of revelation had arrived. The secret she carried, the truth about Alejandro's mistress, was poised to turn the entire gathering upside down, and she intended to deliver it with precision. Lucia's eyes swept across the crowd, taking in every subtle gesture, every whisper, every look of curiosity. She did not rush. She had learned long ago that timing was everything. The longer Alejandro floundered in his anger, the more powerless he appeared. The guests, sensing the shift in control, leaned in slightly, eager for the inevitable unveiling. She stepped forward, her movements deliberate and composed. "Alejandro," she began, her voice carrying clearly without a hint of anger, "you have accused me of deception, humiliation and betrayal without knowing the truth. Yet it seems the reality is far different from the story you are telling everyone here." Her tone was calm but commanding, cutting through the tension like a knife. The room grew quieter still, every eye now fixed on her. Alejandro opened his mouth, his jaw tight, ready to argue, but Lucia's gaze held him in place. He realized he had nothing to counter, not with the weight of truth about to fall. Isabella, meanwhile, glanced nervously toward him as if seeking reassurance, but he could not offer any. The dominance he had tried to project was gone, leaving him vulnerable and exposed. Lucia allowed a moment to pass, letting the suspense settle fully before continuing. "You claim certainty, Alejandro," she said, each word deliberate, "yet it is your assumptions that leave you humiliated. You have blamed the wrong person and overlooked the truth standing right in front of you." She paused again, letting the weight of her words sink in. Gasps rippled through the room as guests exchanged astonished glances, sensing the approaching revelation. Then she delivered the first part of the truth that would shatter the room. "The child you claim is not yours, is a misunderstanding of your own making." Her smirk widened slightly, subtle but deliberate, signaling that she was about to pull back the curtain entirely. Alejandro's eyes widened, his confidence evaporating into sheer disbelief. The guests leaned forward as she stepped closer, her calm composure radiating authority. "Isabella," she said, turning slightly toward the mistress,
The person you claim to carry your husband's child is in fact the one carrying the result of deception, not truth." Every word struck with measured precision, drawing a hush over the gathering. Isabella's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. She realized she had been caught entirely unprepared. Lucia's voice softened, carrying a tone of inevitability. "Alejandro, you have assumed power over a story that you did not fully understand. The child you have accused me of carrying is irrelevant. The real truth is that your mistress is the one carrying your real child." The gasps that followed were immediate and loud, the audience finally fully comprehending the gravity of her words. Alejandro staggered slightly as if the revelation physically hit him, his face drained of color, his hands trembling as he tried to maintain composure.
Isabella's hand flew to her mouth in shock, her earlier arrogance replaced with a dawning panic. She had thought she was untouchable, but now the room had witnessed her vulnerability and the consequences of her duplicity. Lucia's calm smirk did not waver. She had orchestrated this moment perfectly, allowing Alejandro to expose his own arrogance before revealing the truth to the entire room. Every subtle glance, every carefully measured step had been part of a strategy to assert control without aggression. She had not shouted, she had not flailed, but the impact was undeniable. The guests, caught in the drama, whispered among themselves. Some murmured their shock and disbelief, while others nodded in admiration toward Lucia. Alejandro, once the center of attention and power, now stood diminished, a man unmasked before his peers. Isabella, the supposed symbol of control and future prominence, had been reduced to silence, her credibility evaporating in the span of moments. Lucia allowed herself a slow, deliberate step back, surveying the room as the full effect of the revelation settled. Alejandro's anger flared one last time, a desperate attempt to reclaim authority, but it rang hollow. No words could repair the damage done by assumptions, by arrogance, or by underestimating a woman who had remained composed under public scrutiny. "Do you understand now, Alejandro?" Lucia asked softly, each word imbued with quiet power. "The truth cannot be denied, the facts cannot be hidden, and arrogance cannot replace reality." Her gaze locked on him, unyielding and unwavering, as the audience absorbed the moment. Alejandro could only stand, stunned, his hands dropping to his sides,
the weight of his humiliation pressing down like a physical force. Isabella finally found her voice, weak and faltering. This isn't possible," she murmured, but her words were drowned by the collective realization of the guests. Every whisper, every sideways glance, every gasp reinforced the reversal of perception. Lucia had emerged victorious, her dignity intact, while Alejandro and Isabella had been undone by their own assumptions and misjudgments. Lucia allowed a faint, satisfied smile to curve her lips. She did not gloat. She did not need to. The power of composure, intelligence, and precise timing had spoken for her. The room, fully captivated, recognized the shift in authority and respect. Alejandro, once commanding, and now stood diminished. Isabella, once confident, now appeared fragile. Every observer understood who had truly orchestrated the evening's events. As Lucia took a step forward, her presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room, Alejandro tried one last feeble attempt at control. "This changes nothing," he exclaimed, though his voice lacked conviction. His gaze darted nervously toward guests, but their reactions were no longer in his favor. Their expressions ranged from stunned awe to quiet admiration of Lucia's calm strategy and perfect timing. Lucia's smirk deepened, subtle yet undeniable, as she allowed him a final glimpse of reality. "Everything has changed," she said softly, the certainty in her tone final and absolute. "And from this moment on, it is clear who holds the truth and who has been blinded by ego." The room remained silent for a heartbeat, every guest holding their breath as the full impact sank in. Alejandro's shoulders slumped slightly, the fight leaving him, replaced by stunned awareness. Isabella's composure crumbled entirely, leaving her to stand in quiet shock beside him. Lucia, however, remained steady, a pillar of calm amidst the storm she had orchestrated. As whispers began to rise once more, Lucia's eyes swept over the guests, noting their subtle nods, their impressed expressions, and the undeniable shift in respect. The balance of power had irrevocably tilted in her favor, and she knew that the coming moments would solidify her victory completely. She had not just survived public humiliation, she had turned it into a platform of authority, poise, and strategic brilliance. The air in the room felt charged with the weight of revelation.
Where guests began to murmur appreciatively, acknowledging the cleverness, patience, and composure of the woman who had been underestimated. Alejandro and Isabella, once confident and dominating, now remained silent, the room witnessing the full reversal of roles. Lucia allowed herself a slow, controlled breath. She had planned this moment carefully, and it had unfolded precisely as intended. Every detail, every timing choice, every subtle gesture had contributed to the perfect exposure of the truth. The audience had witnessed the collapse of arrogance and the triumph of intelligence, dignity, and measured patience. And in that charged silence, as Alejandro stood stupefied and Isabella faltered beside him, it became unmistakably clear to everyone the power of composure, strategic patience,
An undeniable truth had shifted irrevocably in Lucia's favor. The revelation was complete, and the impact would resonate far beyond this room. The room remained silent for a moment longer after Lucia's revelation, as if the air itself had been reshaped by the weight of the truth. Alejandro's face had drained of color, the arrogance that had once radiated from him replaced by shock, humiliation, and the faintest flicker of fear. Isabella, her carefully constructed confidence shattered, pressed a trembling hand against her stomach, her eyes darting nervously around the guests, searching for allies where none existed. Lucia allowed herself a controlled breath, her posture unyielding, a perfect image of composure and quiet authority. She could feel the energy in the room shifting fully in her favor.
Answer. Every guest now recognized the elegance in her restraint, the brilliance in her patience, and the power of intelligence over bluster. This was not just a personal victory. It was a public statement, one that would echo far beyond the walls of the estate. Alejandro attempted to regain his voice, floundering as he searched for words that could repair his crumbling image. This changes nothing, he spat, his tone sharp but brittle, lacking conviction. He glanced nervously at the guests, hoping for support, but most eyes remained fixed on Lucia, their expressions a mixture of shock and admiration. The facade of control he had maintained for so long had been irrevocably destroyed. Lucia tilted her head slightly, letting a small, deliberate smile play at her lips. "Everything has changed, Alejandro," she said softly.
Her voice carrying easily throughout the room. "The truth has been revealed, and arrogance cannot replace it. You have humiliated yourself, exposed your ignorance, and allowed deception to thrive, while I have stood here calm, composed, and unshaken." Her words were measured, precise, and resonated with undeniable authority. Guests began murmuring, some nodding subtly, some leaning forward to absorb every nuance of the unfolding drama. Alejandro's pride, once towering, now seemed fragile and misplaced. Isabella's attempts to interject were weak and faltering, her earlier confidence having evaporated entirely. The room's energy had shifted irrevocably, aligning with Lucia as the unchallenged focal point of intelligence, composure, and power. Lucia allowed the silence to stretch, giving her moment to fully assert dominance without aggression. She did not need to shout. She did not need to command. Her presence alone conveyed authority. Every subtle movement, every controlled gesture reinforced the story she had orchestrated. A narrative where the truth had been hidden, assumed, and misjudged, and now finally exposed with absolute precision. Alejandro's shoulders slumped slightly, the fight draining from him. He realized, painfully, that his assumptions had led him into complete public humiliation. Isabella's eyes widened as she followed his gaze, realizing that her own social standing had been undermined in a single, carefully orchestrated moment. She had believed herself untouchable, yet she now understood the full extent of her vulnerability. Lucia's voice carried again, soft but unwavering. "You may have thought that dominance, anger, and accusation could control the narrative, Alejandro, but patience, composure, and the careful revelation of truth always prevail." The guests nodded, murmuring quietly among themselves, fully engaged in the lesson unfolding before them. Alejandro's attempt to assert authority had failed spectacularly, leaving him exposed, diminished, and humbled. She turned slightly toward Isabella, her gaze steady, unwavering, and filled with quiet power. "And you, Isabella, thought your deception could shield you from accountability. Yet here you are, revealed, powerless, and unable to defend your lies. Let this be a lesson. Arrogance may deceive briefly, but the truth always finds its stage." The mistress's face paled, her previous self-assurance now replaced by silent shock. Lucia stepped back slightly, allowing the guests to fully absorb the shift in dynamics. Alejandro's anger had dissipated into despair. Isabella's confidence had turned to fear. Every eye in the room now recognized the reversal. The ex-wife, once presumed powerless, had orchestrated the moment with intelligence, timing, and undeniable authority.
A few brave guests approached, their expressions cautious but respectful. "Lucia," one whispered, "that was incredible. You stayed so composed." Another nodded in agreement, their admiration palpable. Lucia acknowledged them with a slight nod, her calm demeanor unwavering. She did not need applause or accolades. The respect and recognition she commanded were implicit, visible in the subtle gestures and attentive stares of those around her. Alejandro attempted a final retort, his voice trembling slightly.
Betraying his inner turmoil. "You think you've won," he murmured, but even he knew the words rang hollow. His once commanding presence had been dismantled, his social standing tarnished, and his credibility questioned. The room no longer followed him. The authority he had relied on had evaporated in the wake of truth and strategy. Lucia allowed herself a subtle, victorious smile. She had not merely defended herself, she had orchestrated a public display of intelligence, composure, and patience that had turned humiliation into triumph. The power of timing, precision, and awareness had allowed her to reclaim authority entirely, leaving her ex-husband and his mistress in stunned defeat. As the evening progressed, the murmurs and whispers became more pronounced, but none challenged her. Alejandro and Isabella retreated toward a quiet corner. Their presence reduced, diminished, and thoroughly undermined. Guests continued to cast discreet glances toward Lucia, their admiration and respect evident. She had not merely survived, she had transformed the entire social landscape of the evening, asserting dominance without aggression, control without arrogance, and victory without force. Lucia finally allowed herself to relax slightly, though she remained fully aware of the audience. Every step she took, every glance she cast, reinforced the authority she had established. Alejandro's misjudgment had been complete. Isabella's deception had been exposed. The truth, finally revealed, had reshaped the narrative entirely. She moved gracefully toward the exit, each step deliberate and measured. The guests parted subtly, allowing her passage, their expressions filled with respect, awe,
and quiet admiration. Alejandro and Isabella followed at a distance, the weight of their defeat palpable in every hesitant movement. Lucia's calm authority dominated the room, leaving an impression that would linger long after she had departed. As she reached the doorway, she paused briefly, turning to glance back at the stunned crowd. Her smirk was subtle, confident, and victorious. The room had witnessed the unraveling of arrogance, the exposure of deception, and the triumph of intelligence and composure. Alejandro and Isabella were left to confront their failures privately, while she walked away publicly victorious. The night air greeted her as she stepped outside, cool and refreshing against her skin. The estate remained behind her, a stage where a drama of lies, assumptions, and arrogance had been meticulously dismantled.
Every step she took carried the weight of dignity, authority, and triumph. The whispers of admiration followed her, a quiet acknowledgement of the power she had wielded without raising her voice, without aggression, without compromise. Lucia allowed herself one final breath, steady and controlled, feeling the satisfaction of her victory. The truth had been revealed, the arrogance punished, and the power dynamic forever altered. She walked away knowing that she had not just survived the evening, she had mastered it, asserting dominance, dignity, and intelligence in a way that would be remembered by everyone present.